You get the atmosphere. I mean, I did find it harrowing. I mean,
Did you find it harrowing?
I did.
At first, it sounded like just another royal rumor, the kind that briefly captures attention before quietly fading away. But then former staff accounts, long-forgotten tensions, and decades of unanswered questions began resurfacing all at once. Suddenly, royal observers were asking a very different question. Were there aspects of Queen Camilla's journey to the throne that King Charles III could never completely escape, no matter how hard the palace tried to move forward? For most of the public, the story of Queen Camilla appears settled. Years of public appearances, official ceremonies, and royal duties have gradually transformed her image from one of the most controversial figures in modern royal history into a recognized member of the monarchy's senior leadership. Yet beneath that carefully constructed public image lies a reality that continues to fascinate royal historians and longtime palace observers. The passage of time may soften controversy, but it rarely erases it completely. What makes this particularly interesting is that the questions surrounding Camilla are not necessarily about who she is today. Instead, they concern decisions, perceptions, and consequences that follow the royal family for decades. Some royal commentators have argued that King Charles III spent much of his adult life balancing two competing realities. One was his personal happiness, the other was the institution he was born to protect. The difficulty was that those two priorities did not always point in the same direction. That tension forms the foundation of the first uncomfortable truth. Long before Camilla became queen, her very presence represented one of the greatest public relations challenges the monarchy had faced in generations. By the early 1990s, public sympathy had become overwhelmingly aligned with Diana, Princess of Wales. As a result, any discussion involving Charles and Camilla was viewed through an emotional lens rather than a constitutional one. Even when official statements attempted to move the conversation forward, public opinion often remained fixed on questions that had never been fully resolved. What made this especially difficult was that perception itself became a form of reality. Institutions can address facts. They cannot easily control emotions. Millions of people had already formed conclusions about the situation, and those conclusions would influence royal coverage for years to come. Some observers believe this created a challenge that Charles never truly escaped. Every step toward legitimizing his relationship required navigating a level of public resistance rarely experienced by modern heirs to the throne. Yet that raises another question. If public opposition was so significant, how did the relationship ultimately survive decades of scrutiny? The answer may reveal a second truth that continues to divide royal audiences even today. Throughout numerous periods of controversy, Charles appeared remarkably determined to maintain the relationship despite the political, institutional, and reputational costs involved. Royal analysts have often pointed out that monarchies typically prioritize stability above all else. Yet in this case, the future king repeatedly accepted criticism, media pressure, and public disapproval rather than abandon a relationship many believed was damaging his image. Some interpret that decision as evidence of extraordinary personal loyalty. Others see it as a gamble that placed personal priorities ahead of institutional concerns. The fact that both interpretations continue to exist decades later demonstrates how unresolved the debate remains. And perhaps that is why the story still attracts attention. Because it forces a larger question about leadership itself. Should future monarchs be expected to sacrifice personal happiness for public duty? Or does a modern monarchy require a more human approach, even when it creates controversy? The answer depends largely on who is asked. However, a third issue complicates the picture even further. Royal watchers have frequently noted that Camilla's path to acceptance was never achieved through a dramatic turning point. Instead, it occurred gradually through years of persistence, visibility, and carefully managed public engagement. On the surface, that appears to be a remarkable rehabilitation of public image. Yet some critics argue that acceptance should not be confused with universal approval. That distinction matters, because approval and acceptance are fundamentally different things. A person can become accepted within an institution, while certain questions about the past continue lingering indefinitely. And that leads to another fascinating observation. Despite serving as queen, Camilla often generates very different reactions from different generations of royal followers. Younger audiences frequently evaluate her based on present-day performance and responsibilities. Older audiences are often more likely to remember the historical context that preceded her arrival at the center of royal life. The result is a unique dynamic. Two people can observe the same royal appearance and come away with entirely different interpretations based on which chapter of history they consider most important. Some royal commentators believe this generational divide explains why discussions about Camilla never seem to disappear entirely. But there may be an even deeper truth hidden beneath all of this. The controversy surrounding Camilla was never solely about Camilla herself. Instead, it became a symbol of something larger. It reflected broader questions about privilege, accountability, loyalty, marriage, public trust, and the responsibilities attached to royal status. In many ways, she became the focal point for debates that extended far beyond any individual member of the royal family. That reality created consequences not only for Charles but for the institution as a whole, because every monarchy depends on public confidence. And public confidence is shaped not only by present actions, but also by how past events are remembered. The challenge, therefore, was never simply winning acceptance in the moment. The challenge was managing a legacy that continued evolving with each passing year. Yet perhaps the most surprising aspect of the story is this. Many of the questions that once dominated headlines are now resurfacing in a completely different context. They are no longer being examined solely as personal controversies. Increasingly, they are being studied as lessons about leadership, reputation, and the long-term consequences of royal decision-making. And as more former staff accounts, historical records, and retrospective analyses continue emerging, some observers believe the conversation surrounding Camilla may be entering an entirely new phase, one that has less to do with old scandals and far more to do with how history ultimately judges the choices that shape the modern monarchy. Because if those reassessments continue gaining momentum, the next layer of the story may reveal that the most significant questions were never about the past at all, but about what those past decisions continue to mean for the future. What makes the story increasingly significant is that the debate surrounding Camilla no longer exists only in the realm of public opinion. Over time, it has become intertwined with questions about how modern monarchies manage reputation, succession, and institutional survival. The further royal observers look beneath the surface, the more they discover that the controversy was never confined to a single relationship. Instead, it touched nearly every major challenge the royal family would face over the next 3 decades. One reason this matters is because the monarchy operates differently from almost every other public institution. Governments can change leaders through elections. Corporations can replace executives. Royal families, however, must maintain continuity while simultaneously adapting to public expectations that are constantly evolving. When trust becomes strained, the consequences are rarely immediate. Instead, they unfold gradually across years, sometimes even generations. That reality has led some royal commentators to focus on a particularly uncomfortable question. If public trust is one of the monarchy's most valuable assets, what happens when a significant portion of the public remains divided about one of its most senior figures? The answer is not straightforward, but the implications are substantial. Because a monarchy depends not only on constitutional authority, but also on symbolic legitimacy. This is where the conversation begins to expand beyond Camilla herself. Several analysts have noted that the royal family spent years attempting to balance 2 competing narratives. The first emphasized personal happiness, reconciliation, and moving forward. The second reflected the lingering emotional attachment many people continued to feel toward Diana's legacy. Neither narrative completely disappeared. Instead, they existed side by side, sometimes peacefully and sometimes in direct conflict. That dual reality created an unusual challenge for the institution. Every major milestone involving Camilla was viewed through 2 different lenses simultaneously. Some saw progress and stability. Others saw unresolved history. The significance of that dynamic becomes clear when considering how carefully royal appearances, public engagements, and ceremonial events are managed. Even seemingly routine moments often carry symbolic weight far beyond what casual observers realize. Yet perhaps the more revealing question is why those tensions continued for so long. According to several royal watchers, the answer may lie in the changing nature of the monarchy itself. Previous generations operated in an environment where palace decisions remained largely behind closed doors. Modern royals exist under constant scrutiny. Every photograph, every public appearance, every family interaction is examined in real time by audiences around the world. That shift changed the stakes entirely. What might once have been viewed as a private family matter gradually became part of a broader conversation about accountability, transparency, and public expectations. In many respects, Camilla's journey unfolded during one of the most transformative periods in royal history, when traditional approaches to reputation management were being tested by an increasingly connected public. And that introduces another layer to the story. Some observers believe that Charles's determination to secure acceptance for Camilla was not merely a personal objective. They argue it also became an institutional project. If the future monarch's chosen partner could not eventually be integrated into public life, what message would that send about the monarchy's ability to adapt to changing social realities? That perspective does not eliminate criticism, but it reframes the discussion. Instead of asking whether acceptance should have occurred, the question becomes whether the institution believed it had any realistic alternative. Royal historians have frequently pointed out that prolonged uncertainty can be more damaging than a controversial decision. An unresolved situation creates instability. Stability, even when imperfect, often becomes the preferred outcome. However, that explanation raises an even larger question. Did acceptance truly resolve the issue, or did it simply move the debate into a different phase? Evidence suggests the latter may be closer to reality. Today, discussions surrounding Camilla rarely focus on the same controversies that dominated headlines decades ago. Instead, they increasingly center on legacy. How will future generations interpret this period? Which narrative will ultimately carry greater weight? And perhaps most importantly, how will historians evaluate the decisions made by senior royals during moments of intense public pressure? Those questions matter because history has a tendency to revisit subjects long after contemporary debates appear settled. Royal commentators have often noted that the monarchy's greatest challenges are not always visible in the moment. Sometimes their true significance becomes clear only years later, when historians begin connecting events that once seemed unrelated. What appears to be a personal story today may eventually be understood as part of a much broader institutional transition. That possibility becomes even more intriguing when attention shifts toward the future king. The Prince of Wales has spent much of his public life observing the consequences of controversies that emerged long before he assumed a leading role within the monarchy. Some analysts suggest that William's approach to public trust, family image, and institutional credibility has been shaped by witnessing those challenges firsthand. If that assessment is accurate, then the significance of Camilla's story extends beyond her own position. It may have influenced how the next generation of royal leadership views risk, reputation, and public accountability. And if that is true, then the story is no longer about a queen consort navigating public opinion. It becomes part of a larger conversation about how future monarchs may approach leadership differently from their predecessors. The implications grow even wider when viewed through that lens. Because every major institution learns from periods of controversy. Lessons are absorbed, strategies are adjusted, and priorities evolve. Some royal observers believe the monarchy's current emphasis on discipline, careful messaging, and measured public engagement reflects years of accumulated experience from earlier reputational challenges. Whether that interpretation is correct remains open to debate. What is harder to dispute is that the consequences of those years continue to shape discussions today. And perhaps that is the most revealing development of all. The more analysts examine the long-term effects of these events, the less the story appears to be about individual personalities, and the more it appears to be about the future direction of the monarchy itself. Because if past controversies have influenced how the institution prepares for its next chapter, then the questions surrounding Camilla may ultimately reveal something far more important than personal history. They may offer clues about how the royal family intends to navigate an era defined by succession, public scrutiny, and changing expectations, a possibility that introduces an entirely new uncertainty and one that becomes impossible to ignore as the next stage of the story begins to come into focus. The deeper analysts examine this story, the more they encounter a striking pattern. The most consequential developments were rarely the ones that generated the loudest headlines. Instead, they were the quieter shifts that occurred behind them. While public attention focused on personalities, the institution itself appeared to be navigating a far more complex challenge, determining how much of the past could be acknowledged while still building a credible future. That observation helps explain something that initially seemed contradictory. For years, acceptance appeared to increase, while debate never completely disappeared. At first glance, those two realities seem incompatible. Yet they can coexist when an institution succeeds in moving forward without necessarily changing everyone's interpretation of what came before. Some royal commentators have suggested that this may have been one of the monarchy's most delicate balancing acts. If so, that raises an important question. Was the objective ever to eliminate disagreement entirely, or was the objective simply to create enough stability for the institution to function effectively despite continuing differences of opinion? The distinction matters because it changes how the entire story is interpreted. Viewed through that lens, many developments begin connecting together. Actions that once appeared reactive start looking strategic. Public appearances become less about image management and more about normalization. The gradual expansion of responsibilities becomes less about individual advancement and more about institutional adaptation. And suddenly the focus shifts. The central question is no longer whether controversies existed. The more revealing question becomes how the monarchy chose to absorb them. Royal historians have frequently noted that enduring institutions survive not because they avoid challenges, but because they learn how to incorporate them into a larger narrative. In this case, some analysts argue that the institution gradually reframed a deeply divisive chapter into a story centered on continuity, service, and long-term stability. Whether one agrees with that approach or not, it may explain why the strategy attracted so much attention among palace observers. Because successful institutional adaptation often reveals itself through consistency. Consistency of messaging, consistency of appearances, consistency of responsibilities, consistency of expectations. Over time, those patterns create familiarity, and familiarity frequently influences public perception more powerfully than isolated events. Yet another layer emerges when examining the timing of broader royal transitions. Several royal watchers have pointed out that the monarchy entered a period in which succession planning, generational change, and evolving public expectations were all occurring simultaneously. That overlap increased the significance of every major decision because each one carried implications beyond the immediate moment. A decision affecting one senior royal could influence perceptions of future leadership. A reputational challenge involving one generation could shape expectations for the next. And that creates a connection many casual observers overlook. Stories that appear personal often become institutional once succession enters the equation. This may explain why discussions surrounding Camilla increasingly intersect with conversations about Prince William, the future king. Not because their roles are identical, but because both occupy positions within the same evolving narrative. One chapter concerns how the institution managed a controversial transition. The other concerns how it prepares for the transitions still ahead. When viewed separately, those stories seem distinct. Viewed together, they begin looking like different stages of the same process. And that realization leads to a deeper question. What lessons were learned? Some analysts have suggested that one lesson may involve the importance of public trust as a long-term strategic priority rather than a short-term communications objective. Public trust can decline rapidly, but rebuilding it often requires years of consistent effort. Institutions that underestimate this reality frequently discover that reputation is far more difficult to restore than to maintain. That interpretation helps explain why modern royal strategy appears increasingly focused on predictability, discipline, and careful public engagement. Not because unpredictability is impossible, but because the cost of reputational instability has become easier to understand. Yet there is another connection that deserves attention. Throughout this story, observers often focus on visible figures while overlooking the pressures operating behind them. Senior royals represent the institution publicly, but they also function within a structure shaped by advisors, expectations, traditions, media realities, and public sentiment. Those forces do not always pull in the same direction. What strengthens personal relationships may create institutional complications. What benefits the institution may generate personal sacrifices. What satisfies one generation may frustrate another. Understanding those competing pressures helps explain why royal decisions often appear more complicated than they initially seem. And perhaps that complexity reveals one of the most uncomfortable truths of all. There may never have been a perfect solution. Royal commentators have frequently argued that every available path carried risks. Every decision produced consequences. Every effort to solve one challenge introduced another. When viewed from that perspective, the story becomes less about identifying heroes or villains and more about understanding the realities of leadership within a highly visible institution. That interpretation does not resolve the debate. In fact, it may deepen it. Because once people begin viewing events through an institutional lens rather than a personal one, entirely new questions emerge. Questions about how monarchies evolve. Questions about how reputations are managed across decades. Questions about how future generations interpret controversial chapters from the past. And perhaps most significantly, questions about who ultimately shapes historical memory. The public, the media, the institution itself, or some combination of all three. Those questions remain unresolved. However, they point towards something increasingly difficult to ignore. The story surrounding Camilla may never have been primarily about a single individual. Instead, it may represent a case study in how modern monarchies navigate periods of intense pressure while attempting to preserve continuity. If that assessment is correct, then everything discussed so far acquires a different meaning. The controversies, the acceptance, the debates, the strategic decisions, the evolving public reactions, all of them may be pieces of a much larger puzzle concerning institutional survival in an age of unprecedented scrutiny. And yet there is still one crucial piece missing. Because understanding how the monarchy responded explains a great deal. What it does not fully explain is whether those responses ultimately transformed the institution itself. And if the answer to that question is more significant than many observers realize, then the next stage of the story may force a complete reevaluation of what these decades of controversy were actually revealing all along. What makes the situation increasingly difficult to ignore is that all of the separate threads begin pointing toward the same destination. Questions about reputation, public trust, institutional strategy, and future leadership no longer appear to be independent issues. Instead, they seem connected by a common challenge facing the monarchy: how to maintain continuity while preparing for inevitable change. That convergence becomes visible when examining the reactions of different generations within the royal family itself. Royal commentators have often noted that every senior royal carries a different burden. The king must preserve stability in the present. The Prince of Wales must prepare for the future. Other senior figures help maintain continuity between the two. When viewed individually, those responsibilities seem straightforward. When viewed together, they create a complex web of expectations that can place enormous pressure on decision-making. This helps explain why debates surrounding Camilla continue attracting attention long after many expected them to fade. The issue is no longer confined to public opinion about a single royal figure. It has become part of a broader assessment of how effectively the institution manages difficult transitions. Every successful transition strengthens confidence. Every controversial one raises new questions. And those questions are becoming increasingly important. Some analysts have argued that the monarchy now operates in an environment where public confidence must be earned continuously rather than inherited automatically. Previous generations could often rely on tradition as a source of authority. Modern royals face a different reality. Visibility creates accountability. Public engagement creates expectations. Every major decision is measured not only against tradition, but also against contemporary standards. That shift has consequences. The greater the public scrutiny, the more significant reputation becomes as a strategic asset. Reputation affects credibility. Credibility affects trust. Trust affects stability. And stability remains one of the institution's most valuable resources. This is where several previously separate pieces of the puzzle begin aligning. The debates surrounding Camilla, the emphasis on carefully managed public appearances, the increasing focus on disciplined messaging, the cautious preparation of future leadership. Viewed separately, these developments appear unrelated. Viewed together, they begin looking like responses to the same underlying pressure. The pressure to ensure that future transitions occur with as little disruption as possible. That realization has led some royal watchers to focus less on personalities and more on institutional priorities. According to this perspective, the monarchy's most important objective is not winning every public debate. It is preserving long-term legitimacy. Temporary controversies can be managed. Structural damage to public confidence is far more difficult to repair. If that assessment is correct, then the significance of past controversies changes dramatically. Instead of being isolated episodes, they become lessons. Lessons about communication. Lessons about public sentiment. Lessons about how rapidly perceptions can shift. And perhaps most importantly, lessons about how future leadership must adapt to avoid repeating similar challenges. This is where attention increasingly turns toward the next chapter. Reports suggest that Prince William's approach to royal responsibilities reflects a heightened awareness of public expectations. Some observers believe the future king understands that trust is built gradually and lost quickly. Whether or not that interpretation is entirely accurate, it highlights a growing awareness inside and outside the institution that reputation management can no longer be treated as a secondary concern. That awareness creates a new kind of pressure, because expectations continue rising. Every decision is examined more closely. Every public appearance carries greater symbolic weight. Every leadership choice is evaluated not only for its immediate impact, but also for what it may reveal about the monarchy's future direction. The result is a situation where consequences extend far beyond individual events. A decision made today may influence public confidence years from now. A reputational challenge faced by one generation may shape opportunities available to the next. And that creates a level of strategic importance that many casual observers never see. Yet another consequence is beginning to emerge. The more attention shifts toward future leadership, the more historical controversies are reassessed through a different lens. Questions that once focused on personal relationships increasingly become questions about institutional resilience. Analysts are no longer asking only what happened. They are asking what the institution learned from what happened. That distinction is crucial, because learning implies change, and change raises another question. How much has the monarchy already evolved as a result of these experiences? Some royal commentators believe the answer may be more significant than many realize. They point to an institution that appears increasingly conscious of public perception, increasingly selective in its messaging, and increasingly focused on demonstrating stability during periods of uncertainty. Whether those changes represent adaptation or necessity remains open to interpretation. However, the pressure driving them appears difficult to dispute. The monarchy faces the challenge of remaining relevant while preserving continuity. It must embrace modernization without abandoning tradition. It must prepare future leaders while maintaining confidence in current leadership. And every major controversy inevitably becomes part of that balancing act. This is why the story has begun feeling larger with each new layer. What initially appeared to concern one royal figure now appears connected to leadership preparation, institutional survival, and public trust across generations. The stakes have expanded beyond personalities. They now involve questions about how the monarchy intends to navigate the decades ahead. And perhaps that is the strongest implication yet. Because if these controversies have quietly influenced how future leadership is being shaped, then their true significance may not be found in the past at all. It may be found in decisions that have not yet been made, decisions that could determine how the next era of the monarchy is remembered. And if the evidence discussed so far points in that direction, then one crucial question remains unanswered. Have these years of pressure merely changed public perceptions, or have they fundamentally altered the institution's understanding of itself? Because if the answer is the latter, then the final piece of a story may force a completely different interpretation of everything that came before. As the final pieces fall into place, the story begins to look very different from the way it appeared at the beginning. What once seemed like a discussion about controversy increasingly resembles a discussion about adaptation. The focus is no longer on individual headlines, individual criticisms, or even individual personalities. Instead, attention shifts toward a larger question. How does an institution survive when the expectations placed upon it change faster than the traditions that define it? That may be the reason royal observers continue paying attention long after many expected the debate to fade. The real significance lies not in what happened, but in what the response revealed. Throughout the story, one theme has quietly emerged above all others: the monarchy's capacity to absorb pressure without losing continuity. Every challenge created uncertainty. Every controversy tested credibility. Every difficult period forced decisions that carried consequences far beyond the immediate moment. Yet the institution continued moving forward. That outcome is more significant than it may initially appear. Because institutions are ultimately judged not only by how they perform during stable periods, but by how they respond when stability is challenged. Some analysts have suggested that this may be one of the most important lessons hidden within the story. Public debates often focus on personalities because personalities are visible. Institutions operate differently. Their defining moments are frequently revealed through systems, responses, and long-term adjustments rather than dramatic public announcements. Viewed from that perspective, the broader meaning becomes easier to understand. The discussion surrounding Camilla was never simply a question of acceptance or rejection. It became a test of whether the monarchy could guide public perception through a period of significant change while maintaining confidence in its future direction. Whether observers supported that process or criticized it, the fact that the transition occurred at all carries implications that extend far beyond a single royal figure. And that is where the future enters the conversation. Because the institution now faces a different challenge than the one it faced years ago. The question is no longer whether it can navigate a controversial transition. The question is whether it can apply the lessons learned from that transition to the next era of leadership. That shift in focus explains why discussions increasingly return to succession, preparation, and public trust. Royal commentators have frequently noted that every generation inherits not only opportunities, but also unresolved questions. Future leaders rarely begin with a blank slate. They inherit public expectations shaped by decisions made decades earlier. The implications of that reality are profound. Every reputational challenge becomes part of institutional memory. Every successful adaptation becomes part of institutional strategy. Every difficult lesson becomes part of future decision-making. And over time, those accumulated experiences shape the monarchy's evolution far more than any single event ever could. This may explain why some royal watchers view the story as a turning point rather than an isolated chapter. Not because it produced immediate transformation, but because it demonstrated the mechanisms through which transformation occurs. Major institutions rarely change overnight. They evolve gradually, often responding to pressures that are barely visible until years later. By this stage, the deeper pattern becomes increasingly difficult to miss. Public trust has emerged as the central issue beneath every other discussion. Not popularity, not headlines, not temporary approval ratings. Trust. Trust determines whether leadership is accepted. Trust determines whether continuity feels credible. Trust determines whether future transitions occur smoothly or encounter resistance. And trust must be maintained across generations. That responsibility creates pressures unlike any faced by ordinary public figures. Royal roles are unique because their success is measured not only in the present but also in the future. Decisions made today may be evaluated differently decades from now. Actions intended to solve immediate challenges may ultimately be remembered for their long-term consequences. Some observers believe this is why the institution has become increasingly focused on stability, consistency, and disciplined public engagement. Those priorities are not simply communication strategies. They may represent an understanding that credibility must be cultivated continuously if future leadership is to inherit a strong foundation. That realization brings us closer to the story's deepest meaning. What has been revealed is not merely how one controversial chapter was managed. What has been revealed is how the monarchy appears to think about continuity itself. Continuity does not require every person to agree. Continuity does not eliminate criticism. Continuity does not erase difficult history. Instead, continuity depends upon maintaining enough confidence that the institution can move forward despite disagreement. That distinction changes everything. Because once continuity becomes the focus, individual controversies begin appearing less as isolated problems and more as tests of institutional resilience. The question ceases to be whether challenges exist. Challenges always exist. The more important question becomes whether the institution possesses the capacity to adapt while remaining recognizably itself. For many royal analysts, that is precisely why the story matters. It offers a glimpse into how the monarchy approaches change. It reveals how reputation and leadership intersect. It demonstrates the growing importance of public trust. And it highlights the reality that future success may depend less on tradition alone and more on how effectively tradition and modernization are balanced together. Yet even now, the broader story remains unfinished. The immediate questions may be clearer than they once were, but the larger future remains open. King Charles III continues guiding the institution through a period of transition. Prince William, the Prince of Wales, continues preparing for responsibilities that will eventually define an era. The next generation will inherit both the strengths and the lessons created by those who came before them. And perhaps that is the strongest insight of all. This was never simply a story about Camilla. It was a story about adaptation, a story about legitimacy, a story about leadership under scrutiny, a story about how institutions respond when public expectations evolve. Most importantly, it was a story about continuity in a changing world. Years from now, historians may debate specific decisions, specific controversies, and specific personalities. Those discussions will undoubtedly continue. What may prove even more significant, however, is what this period ultimately revealed about the monarchy's ability to navigate uncertainty while preparing for the future. The immediate chapter may now be easier to understand. What remains uncertain is how history will ultimately interpret its meaning. Will this period be remembered primarily as a controversial royal episode, or as an important stage in the monarchy's long-term evolution toward its next generation of leadership? If you enjoyed this deep dive into the royal family, Prince William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, King Charles III, Princess, and the future of the monarchy, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next royal analysis. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you in the next video.